My parents hid my college acceptance letter to force me into marriage. When I tried to walk out, they locked me in my room. At the rehearsal dinner, my aunt spoke up and the family ended with the wedding. My parents had one rule which they considered as the 12th commandment: no dating until after high school graduation. They would continually lecture me about how teenage romances were merely diversions from schoolwork and how every lady who dated in high school ended up ruining her life. They even made me sign a contract on my 15th birthday stating that I would not date until I was 19. My father laminated it and posted it on the refrigerator like a warning notice. I spent every school dance at home watching Netflix while my pals texted me recordings of them slow dancing with their boyfriends. When asked why I never went to social events, I had to make up reasons about being too busy with violin practice that didn't exist. My mother would drive by the movie theater on Friday nights to make sure I wasn't with anyone. Their anxiety was so strong that when a boy from chemistry class wanted to borrow my notes, my father quizzed me for an hour about whether we were meeting covertly. Every male contact in my phone had to be labeled with their complete name and how I knew them, so my parents could confirm they were simply classmates. Then during junior year, I met Luke at my volunteer position at the animal shelter, which my parents pushed me to do since it would look well on my college applications. He was a senior at another school who came in every Saturday to help with the dogs. My parents didn't know him, and we worked in different portions of the shelter so we could chat without anyone reporting back to them. After 3 months of clandestine discussions while walking dogs and cleaning kennels, he asked if I wanted to study together at the library. That led to hidden coffee runs during my pretend tutoring sessions and then actual dates at places across town that my parents would never visit. We kept everything disguised by using my phone's messaging program, which looked like a calculator. I became adept at living a parallel life where I was the perfect rule-following daughter at home and a regular adolescent when they assumed I was at debate practice or studying with a friend. But then on Thursday night, my appendix chose to literally rupture inside my body. The pain began during supper, and within minutes I was curled up on the lavatory floor, feeling as if someone had stabbed me with a hot knife. I couldn't breathe sufficiently to inform my parents that something was badly wrong with my stomach. My mother took one look at me and assumed I was exaggerating my period cramps, as she often did when I was sick. My father agreed, saying I only needed to take some ibuprofen and sleep it off. When I started throwing up and couldn't even stand up straight, they accused me of trying to avoid my calculus test the next morning. They actually ordered me to bed and told me not to be so dramatic about everyday teenage girl issues. By midnight, the agony was so severe that I was seeing spots and could barely stay awake. But my parents had gone to bed and switched off their phones like they always did. I crawled to my phone and texted Luke that something was seriously wrong and that I believed I would die, which sounds dramatic, but was genuinely true at that moment. He didn't hesitate to tell my parents he was coming to collect me whether they liked it or not. He was hurling rocks at my window and helping me climb down the trellis in my pajamas, all while I tried not to cry from the agony. When I couldn't walk longer, he took me to his car and drove at 90 mph to the emergency hospital while I sobbed in the passenger seat. The doctors hurried me into surgery right away because my appendix had ruptured and I was in septic shock, which would have killed me if Luke had waited even an hour. When I awoke following surgery, my parents stood next to my hospital bed, looking absolutely devastated. Luke was still in the waiting area despite the fact that it was 600 a.m. and he had been awake all night. The surgeon informed my parents that Luke had saved my life by bringing me to the hospital when he did, and that their son was a hero for realizing the gravity of the situation. My mother began crying and hugging Luke, while my father shook his hand and again apologized for not believing me about the agony. My parents remained silent on the trip home from the hospital 3 days later until my father finally cleared his throat and stated that they needed to apologize for everything. My mother agreed that they had been too rigid and that I had definitely made the right decision in picking someone like Luke who cared enough to risk getting into trouble to save my life. They said I could officially date him and even invite him over for dinner to thank him properly. I felt so relieved. I began to cry until my mother turned around in her seat with a bright smile and whispered the words that changed everything. "We've decided you two are so perfect for each other that you should get married. We already put down the deposit on the venue. The wedding is next month." My surgical incision began to hurt harder as I grasped the car door handle and looked at my mother's eager expression. She kept talking about roses versus lilies, while my father nodded along, and I wondered whether the opium was causing me to hallucinate the entire conversation. The rest of the drive home was a jumble of wedding details shouted off by my mother as I held my hand against my stomach and tried not to vomit from the pain meds or the shock. When we came home, I rushed straight to the toilet and locked the door before pulling out my phone and texting Luke with shaky hands. I typed, "They want us to get married next month, not joking," and sent it before sitting on the locked toilet lid. His reaction was rapid with 18 question marks followed by, "Are your parents having a mental breakdown?" I could hear my mother downstairs on the phone with someone about catering menus. I pulled myself into my bedroom and collapsed on the bed where that dumb laminated dating contract hung as if it were a joke. The one I signed at 15, promising not to date until I was 19, was right there mocking me while my parents arranged my wedding 4 months before I graduated. My stomach hurt more than the surgery site as I stared at the ceiling until Chloe peeked through my door. She muttered that Mom had gone wild and was browsing for wedding clothes online, which made me laugh and cry at the same time. That night, my father pushed a 3-inch notebook across the table, labeled with color-coded sections for venue catering and guest list. I opened it to discover 210 names already entered in alphabetical order, along with addresses and phone numbers. I pushed my soup bowl away and told them forcefully that I was 18 and couldn't legally marry. But my mother simply smiled. She chirped that parental approval made it legal in California, and they'd already looked into all the criteria at the courtroom. 2 days later, Luke showed up for the thank you dinner my parents had promised him. Dressed in his sole button-down shirt, my parents grinned at him as if he were already their son-in-law, while he continued to send me bewildered looks across the table. I mouthed, "Play along," while making nervous eye contact as my mother served his favorite foods, which she had discovered after stalking his social media. She had baked chicken parmesan and chocolate cake after supposedly scrolling through 3 years of his Instagram posts. After supper, we sat on the porch swing while my folks watched us from the living room window as if we were a zoo exhibit. Luke whispered that we'd just been dating for 4 months and hadn't met my parents officially until now. My surgical site stung as I told how my parents thought they were doing something great by going from one extreme to the other. They'd gone from prohibiting any dating to organizing our wedding in 3 days as if that was completely normal. The next morning, I found out that my mother had already contacted my school concerning extraordinary circumstances for early graduation. She had informed them that my medical complications from the surgery required me to hurry my diploma so that I could focus on wedded life. The guidance counselor called me instantly perplexed by the request and wondering if everything was fine at home. I had to pretend the connection was terrible and hang up before she could ask any further questions about why my mother thought I was getting married. Lily arrived for our regular study session that afternoon, but my mother intercepted her at the front door with a stack of wedding invites. She handed Lily a calligraphy pen and urged her to start addressing envelopes while I watched in dread from the staircase. Lily's eyes widened as she read, "Emma Mitchell and Luke Harrison request the honor of your presence," which was printed in elegant gold letters. She mouthed something at me from across the room while my mother explained that we needed to mail these by Friday. That night, I attempted to have a sensible chat with my parents about my desire to complete high school normally and attend college. My father explained that married students receive higher financial aid, and Luke could help me while I studied part-time. My mother added that they had already paid $9,000 in non-refundable deposits so they couldn't back out. She'd reserved the country club, engaged a photographer, and placed a rush order for a custom wedding gown in my size. The next morning, Chloe knocked on my door holding her phone and looking panicked. She showed me screenshots from our mother's Facebook page where she had publicized the engagement to our entire extended family. I was intrigued by how my parents moved from zero to wedding preparation in 3 days. How did they investigate all the legal requirements for parental consent so quickly? The post featured photographs from Luke's Instagram that she had modified to look like professional relationship portraits using a filter tool. Comments poured in with astonished congrats, and my aunt from Texas had already mentioned that she was planning trips. I grabbed my phone and dialed Dr. Patel's number while Chloe eyed me with concern. The nurse who answered recognized my name and inquired about my recuperation status. I described the wedding circumstance and requested the doctor if he could write something indicating that I required longer recovery time. She sat silent for a time before saying that the doctor could only become involved in family problems if there was actual abuse. My parents' strangely kind behavior and pressuring me to marry did not count as anything doctors could prevent. I hung up feeling absolutely trapped while Chloe simply shook her head. 3 days had gone since the announcement, and the situation was getting worse by the hour. Luke texted me that his parents had just contacted him screaming since they had received a formal invitation in the mail. The elegant card invited them to dinner to talk about their children's future together. His mother was a paralegal, and she was already looking into whether underage marriage was allowed in California. He stated he was parked in his car outside my house but was too terrified to enter. He didn't want to leave me alone, but he didn't know how to deal with my parents anymore. That night, Pastor Collins came over for supper, and he appeared to be very uncomfortable throughout. My parents continued saying how they were blessed youthful love and giving us the best start in life. He suggested that couples seek counseling for at least 6 months before getting married. My mother just chuckled and remarked, "True love didn't need to wait when it was obvious we were meant to be." While my parents debated whether to use roses or lilies as centerpieces, Pastor Collins stared at me and mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." He departed shortly after dessert, claiming he had another appointment, but I could tell he just wanted to leave. A week following my operation, I returned to school, and it was a total nightmare. Everyone had read my mother's Facebook posts and assumed I was getting married by choice. In the hallways, kids I had never met before approached me to congratulate me. My chemistry instructor approached me and said marriage was a tremendous responsibility, but she was delighted for me. I attempted to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but nobody believed me. The worst thing was that rumors started spreading about why the wedding was taking place so quickly. By lunchtime, everyone had concluded that I was pregnant, which would explain both the emergency operation and the rushed wedding. Lily caught me crying in the bathroom and brought me to the library where she had assembled our friend group. She'd started a group chat called Save Emma, and everyone was pitching ideas to stop the wedding. Someone proposed staging a pregnancy scare for Luke to terrify my parents. Another acquaintance wanted to contact Child Protective Services and report the entire situation. I told them none of it would work since my parents would see any involvement as envy or someone attempting to spoil my happiness. If they suspected that individuals were attempting to halt the wedding, they would most likely move it forward even further. When I arrived home that afternoon, I discovered my mother's old wedding planning notebook in the garage. It was dated when she was 17 and contained magazine cutouts and handwritten notes about her ideal wedding. She had prepared every detail, including the dress flowers and first dance song. Then at the bottom of one page, she wrote "canceled because of baby," along with the date she discovered she was pregnant with me. Everything finally made sense, even why she was so eager about this wedding. She was living out the youthful wedding fantasies she never had because of me. That evening over dinner, the venue planner called to discuss the final menu options for the reception. My father handed me the phone saying I should choose anything I wanted because it was my special day. I purposefully selected the most expensive choice for each course, intending to price them out of this madness. My mother just clapped her hands and stated nothing was too good for her daughter's wedding. The organizer informed my parents that the revised total would be nearly double the initial estimate, but they didn't flinch. Meanwhile, Luke met with his older brother who was attending law school to discuss our alternatives. His brother stated that parents could legally consent to a teen marriage, but I could seek emancipation from my parents or wait until I was 18 to apply for an annulment claiming coercion. The legalities were convoluted, and we were just two youngsters looking to date like regular teenagers. Later that week, Chloe came into my room and closed the door behind her, appearing serious. She brought out her phone, revealing that she had been covertly recording our parents' chats for days. She showed me a video of our mother talking to someone on the phone about how I needed structure in my life. Mom said that marriage would prevent me from making the same mistakes she did as a teenager. Chloe had been documenting everything so that I may have documentation if needed later. My parents shocked me the next Saturday by unexpectedly driving me to a bridal dress shop. The consultant had previously pulled clothes based on what my mother had told her on the phone. They forced me try on dress after dress while my mother grieved over her baby's wedding. I stood on the platform in a $3,200 outfit, feeling as if I were in a nightmare. Other customers continued to stare at me and whisper to each other. One woman questioned if we belonged to one of those religious groups who marry off their daughters at a young age. The consultant gave me sympathetic looks but said nothing. My mother ultimately chose a dress with far too many sparkles and a train that stretched endlessly while I stood there feeling numb. We left the store with the dress in a large pink bag and drove home in silence, except for my mother discussing flower arrangements and whether we should serve chicken or fish at the reception. The next morning at school, I was headed to my locker when Lily's mother emerged in the corridor and gently patted my shoulder. She worked as a social worker at the county office, and her sweet voice made you want to tell her everything. She asked if we could speak quietly and brought me to an empty classroom where she closed the door and sat at one of the desks. I described how my parents thought they were assisting me by organizing this wonderful wedding for the boy who saved my life and how they truly believed it was the best thing for my future. She listened without interrupting, then took out a business card from her purse. "Coercive control is still control, honey," she remarked quietly as she left me alone in the classroom. After school, Luke picked me up in his beat-up Honda and drove us to the park where no one would see us, unless our parents were watching. He turned off the engine and stared at the steering wheel for a long time before recommending that we simply run away. I reminded him that we had no money and nowhere to go, and I was still dizzy from the surgery when I stood up too quickly. We sat there holding hands and watching children play on the swings, both aware that we were absolutely trapped. 2 days later, while my parents were at work, I went into my father's study to seek for stamps and discovered a stack of opened envelopes buried beneath his tax documents. 3 college acceptance letters with scholarship offers that needed to be returned by next month were sitting there, the edges torn open. Northwestern offered me nearly a full ride to their journalism department, and 2 state institutions had granted me merit scholarships that would cover the majority of my tuition. When my mother arrived home, I showed her the letters, and she merely shrugged, saying they were to keep me from becoming distracted during the wedding planning. That Sunday, we sat in our customary pew at church while Pastor Collins stood at the podium and began discussing how God gave young people free will for a reason. He kept staring at my parents as he explained how forcing youngsters to make adult decisions before they were ready contradicted everything the Bible taught about patience and wisdom. My mother's cheeks became scarlet, and my father's jaw became so rigid that I felt he may fracture a tooth. The entire crowd kept gazing at us and murmuring to one another as Pastor continued to lecture about allowing teenagers to mature at their own speed. After the service, my mother confronted Pastor in the parking lot and informed him that if he ever attacked our family again during a sermon, we would find another church. The next day, a photographer arrived at our house with a bunch of equipment for engagement photos that my parents had booked without informing me. My mother handed me a yellow sundress she had purchased and instructed me to put it on and grinned like I meant it. Luke came looking terrible in the button-down shirt his mother had left for him to wear. We stood in the backyard as the photographer positioned us beneath the oak tree and instructed us to appear cheerful and in love. Chloe kept sneaking into the background, forming bunny ears and sticking her tongue out, forcing the photographer to retake each shot. She pretended to pick her nose in one photo and made vulgar hand gestures in another before my father took her inside and punished her for a week. We had barely finished taking shots when a taxi arrived, and my Aunt Julia from Texas stepped out with 2 luggage and marched straight up to the front door. She took one look at me in the sundress, Luke alongside me, and wanted to know why her 18-year-old niece was dressed like a bride. My mother tried to explain that the wedding was a celebration of Luke saving my life, but Julia interrupted her and stated she was living out her failed dreams via me. They began screaming at each other in the living room, and Julia accused my mother of being envious that she had never had her dream wedding when she was younger. My mother's expression changed from astonished to hurt to outraged in approximately 3 seconds before telling Julia to leave her house. The next morning, Luke's parents arrived for the meeting that my parents had requested, accompanied by their oldest son, a Sacramento lawyer. His mother, Ruth, placed a folder of legal documents on our coffee table and began discussing all of the data about teenage weddings and divorce rates. My father responded by pulling up Luke's Instagram on his phone and showing them images of us at the animal shelter, alleging their son had been secretly pursuing me for months. The tension in the room became so intense that I couldn't breathe. So I fled upstairs to the bathroom where I discovered Chloe already cowering in the bathtub with her headphones on. We sat together on the hard tile floor, while the voices downstairs became increasingly louder. Chloe took out her phone and whispered that she had been recording everything our parents said and saving it to cloud storage in case I needed it later for court or something. When Ruth indicated that my parents were psychologically assaulting me by forcing this wedding, the arguing downstairs escalated into full-on yelling. My mother completely lost it and began screaming that they had produced a predator who targeted young girls for charity work. She threw them out the front door, screaming that Luke had misled and corrupted me. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Luke, who was sitting in his parents' car claiming his mother was calling CPS and that everything had gone nuts. The next day at school, Lily recruited 5 other friends and cornered me in the chemistry lab during lunchtime with a complete presentation they had prepared. They had published stories regarding forced marriage and statistics on teen divorce, as well as leaflets from legal help organizations. They encircled me at the lab table, each saying why this wedding was a bad idea and how they might help me get out of it. I started crying so hard that I couldn't see the papers they were showing me. I told them I had no idea how to stop this without killing my entire family and making my parents hate me forever. Lily's mother picked me up from school that afternoon and drove me home in silence, leaving me staring out the window feeling as if my entire world was falling apart. When I arrived home, my mother was in the kitchen, surrounded by wedding magazines and fabric samples, humming to herself and writing notes in a pink notebook decorated with heart stickers. She smiled at me and began telling me about how she had selected the ideal ivory color for my dress and how the florist had these lovely roses that would go well with it. I mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and headed upstairs, where I discovered her bag open on the dresser. Something prompted me to look inside, and I saw the prescription bottle for her anxiety medicine nestled beneath a stack of wedding preparation books. The bottle was totally full, despite the fact that the label indicated it had been replenished 3 weeks previously. My hands began to shake as I realized she had not been taking her pills at all. And suddenly, her frantic excitement over this wedding made terrible sense. I heard a car pull up outside and looked out the window to see a woman in a gray suit exit with a clipboard and an official-looking credential. My stomach fell as she stepped up to our front door and rang the doorbell, leaving me transfixed at the top of the stairs, listening to my mother answer it in her fake, pleasant voice. The woman presented herself as a representative from Child Protective Services and stated that they had received a complaint of concerns about a juvenile in the family. My father emerged from his office, and both my parents began talking at once about how this must be a terrible misunderstanding. They invited the investigator into the living room, and my mother quickly pulled out her phone to show texts she said I had sent about being thrilled for the wedding. She showed the woman newspaper articles about Luke saving my life, as well as the surgeon's thank you message praising my lover as a hero. The investigator nodded and took notes as my parents built an image of appreciative parents attempting to support their daughter's connection with a lad who had saved her life. Everything appeared to be going their way until Chloe walked downstairs and paused at the doorway. She stared at the investigator, then at our parents, and back at the investigator before saying the 2 words that altered everything. The investigator's head jumped up and she requested Chloe to repeat what she had said. My parents attempted to intervene, but the woman raised her hand and requested to meet with me quietly. My mother's face became white when the investigator followed me up to my room and closed the door behind us. She sat on my desk chair, and I perched on the edge of my bed, my surgical wound hurting from stress. She questioned me directly about the wedding and whether I wanted to marry. I continued looking at my hands, torn between stating the truth and protecting my parents, who I knew loved me even when they were mad. I told her they were just overwhelmed with appreciation for Luke and may have gotten carried away with wanting to thank him. She documented everything and requested to see my surgery scar, which was still red and inflamed. She photographed it and stated that she would need to follow up in a week to ensure that I was healing properly and to monitor the problem. After she left, my parents were unusually silent at supper, passing dishes without making eye contact. The next morning, they both went early for work, and Pastor Collins arrived about 10 huzaras, finding me on the porch swing trying to read, but mostly staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and stated that he had been counseling couples for 20 years but had never seen anything like this before. He stated he may refuse to perform the wedding on religious grounds because I was still a juvenile and hadn't gone through premarital counseling, but he warned that if my parents were desperate enough, they could find someone else who wouldn't ask too many questions and even drive to Vegas. Days later, with only 10 days till the scheduled wedding, I was looking for my calculus textbook in my mother's car when I came across a folder labeled Emma's Future. Inside were emails she'd been sending to all of my professors, explaining that I'd be switching to online education after my wedding so I could focus on becoming a wife. My hands felt numb as I read her promises about finishing my final year from home while adjusting to married life. The next morning, my principal summoned me to his office and handed me the emails my mother had sent. He leaned forward with genuine worry in his eyes, saying he could intercede if I asked him to, and that the school had resources to assist students in difficult family situations. I opened my mouth to say yes, ask for assistance, or declare everything was nuts, but nothing came out. I just sat there transfixed, unable to reject the parents who had reared me even if they were ruining my future. Aunt Julia arrived that evening when my mother was at her reading group and confronted my father in the garage where he was pretending to organize his equipment. I could hear them through the door as she informed him she knew about Mom's bipolar diagnosis from when they were younger, which my parents had kept secret from us all our lives. She said if they didn't postpone the wedding right away, she'd tell me and Chloe about Mom's history of manic episodes and hospitalizations. My father's voice trembled as he begged her not to say anything, claiming Diane was delicate right now, and that this wedding was the only thing keeping her stable and joyful. 2 days later, Chloe discovered me in the bathroom at 2:00 a.m. fully dressed and sitting under the chilly shower spray, tears streaming down my cheeks. She didn't say anything at first, just slipped up beside me in her pajamas and grabbed my hand. I finally stated that I'd been suffering panic attacks since the surgery, waking up gasping for air, and not knowing whether it was trauma from nearly dying or dread about this wedding that was truly happening. We sat there in the chilly water till our fingers became purple and our teeth chattered, both of us unsure what to say. Meanwhile, Luke had begun missing his morning courses to sit in the public library surrounded by law texts on emancipation and minor rights. The librarian, an elderly woman with sympathetic eyes, took notice of his stack of legal literature and gently sat down next to him. She stated that her daughter had gone through a similar experience with controlling parents and gave him a business card for a family law attorney who worked pro bono for teens in crisis situations. That night, while serving pasta, my mother slammed a manila folder on the table in front of me. Inside were my college acceptance letters, which I had concealed in my closet. Letters from colleges to which I had discreetly applied using the address of the school counselor. She waved them in my face, yelling that I had always planned to forsake them, that I was selfish and ungrateful for everything they had done for me. My father supported her, stating that college could wait until after I was married and that a good woman prioritized her family over her work. The area where they had removed my appendix began throbbing and burning as if it were about to break open due to the stress. I dashed over to Lily's place after dinner, and her mother took one glance at my wrists where my mother had seized me during her scream and instantly pulled out her camera. She documented every bruise and red mark while emphasizing that she was a mandated reporter and that physical control paired with forced marriage constituted abuse regardless of my parents' stated intentions. She filed the report that night as I sat in their kitchen drinking tea with trembling hands, knowing that in 8 days my parents wanted me to go down wedding aisle in a white dress and swear to follow a boy I'd only kissed 3 times. The next morning, Luke picked me up 2 blocks from my house while my parents assumed I was at a follow-up doctor's visit. We traveled to a small downtown law office where Karen Walsh greeted us with coffee and a stack of papers that made my stomach drop. She described my 3 alternatives while I sat there feeling like I was about to vomit again. Emancipation would take months and would require proof that I could support myself financially, which was impossible given that I couldn't even work yet due to my surgery. Refusing to attend the real ceremony would disgrace my parents in front of everyone they had invited, but it would not deter them from trying again. Running away until I was 18 meant losing my health insurance just when I needed it most for post-surgery care and meds. I left that meeting feeling even more constrained than before, but Luke grabbed my hand and swore we'd sort it out together. Days later, the wedding gown came for final changes at the store my mother had chosen. The seamstress was pinning the hem when I abruptly jumped up and said that I was canceling the wedding entirely. My mother's face turned white before she gasped for oxygen and collapsed straight on the store floor. The staff contacted 911 while I crouched alongside her, gripping my hand so hard it hurt and gasping, "Don't leave me," repeatedly. I rode in the ambulance with her holding her hand as the paramedics administered oxygen and checked her vitals. At the hospital, they stabilized her and brought her to a private room where I sat in the corner. I overheard the doctor speak to my father in the corridor about her bipolar medication and how she hadn't been taking it correctly. They considered placing her on an involuntary mental hold if she continued to refuse treatment, but my father asked them to wait. He informed them that arranging the wedding was therapeutic for her, which made me want to scream. Luke came to see me in the hospital cafeteria while my mother was sedated upstairs. We sat at a corner table drinking horrible coffee and debating if we should just break up publicly to end everything, but we both knew it would most likely push my mother over the brink, and neither of us wanted that on our conscience. He softly stated that we were stuck by their mental sickness, and I couldn't disagree with him about it. The next day, Chloe came to my room and showed me her phone, which included thousands of comments on a Reddit topic. She'd been tweeting about our issue anonymously for days, and it had gone fully viral with people offering help and sharing their own stories. She showed me messages from journalists asking to interview us, but I told her not to respond to any of them. The next morning, my mother returned home from the hospital, determined as ever to plan the wedding. She began calling all of the vendors, insisting that they move things forward by 2 days since she did not want to risk anything else happening. When I tried to resist, she took my phone and laptop and locked me inside my room. She said it was for my own good until the ceremony, and I'd thank her someday for keeping me safe from myself. Chloe was able to slide my phone back through the heating vent between our rooms that night. I quickly texted Luke, Lily, and the social worker at the hospital who had given me her card. Lily's mother instructed me through Lily to call 911 if I was being kept against my will, but I couldn't do so with my already unstable mother. The next morning, Pastor Collins arrived for what my mother called necessary premarital counseling. He discovered me confined in my room and ordered that my mother get me out immediately or he would contact the authorities himself. She eventually unlocked the door, but then sat right next to me for the whole session, interrupting me whenever I tried to say anything. The pastor continued to write notes while observing my mother's conduct, and I could tell he was meticulously documenting everything. 4 days before the wedding, my aunt returned, but this time with backup. My mother's arranged sister Helen was there, as was my grandmother, whom I hadn't seen in 5 years. The living room became a battlefield as decades of ancient fights erupted all at once. Helen abruptly disclosed that my mother had been hospitalized for postpartum psychosis after I was born, which no one had ever told me. My mother began yelling that Helen was lying while my father attempted to calm everyone down, and my grandmother simply sat there crying. During the hubbub, Chloe grabbed my arm and pushed me towards the rear entrance. We dashed to Lily's house where her mother was already waiting with Karen, the attorney from earlier. Karen had emergency papers for a temporary restraining order scattered across their kitchen table. My hands shook so terribly that I could scarcely hold the pen as I signed my name, knowing that this would end my relationship with my parents forever. Lily's mother arranged blankets on their couch, but I couldn't close my eyes without recalling my mother's contorted expression from earlier. Around midnight, I gave up on sleeping and sat by the window watching the street outside while my phone buzzed on the coffee table. My mother's missed calls continued to soar above 30, then 40, with each message becoming more furious and threatening until I eventually flipped the phone face down. At 3:00 a.m., a familiar automobile crept down the street, moving so slowly that the headlights hardly moved against the walls. My father's sedan drove past Lily's house once, twice, and 3 times before stopping 2 houses down with the motor running. I watched him sit there for 20 minutes staring at Lily's front door when my phone lit up with a text that chilled my hands. My father sent me a message saying, my mother was talking about injuring herself and I needed to come home right away. I was still staring at those lines when the automobile made its 4th pass and came to a stop directly in front of the home. Blue and red lights flashed over the room as 2 police cars approached my father's sedan. At 3:30 in the morning, the doorbell rang, and Lily's mother went downstairs in her bathrobe, leaving me pressed against the wall, straining to hear what was going on. The officers explained that my parents had reported me as a runaway, and they needed to make sure I was secure. Lily's mother tried to show them the restraining order paperwork Karen had made, But one of the officers shook his head and claimed it hadn't been filed with the court yet, therefore it was invalid. My parents stood behind the police looking completely calm and anxious like any worried parent would. My mother had even changed into regular clothes and adjusted her cosmetics, making her appear entirely normal after hours of yelling. The officer said that I could either come home freely, or they would have to conduct a further investigation, which could include charging my parents with false imprisonment if I claimed they were holding me against my will. Lily's mother claimed that I was 17 and should have some say in where I stayed. But the cops insisted that without filed papers, I remained a child in my parents' custody. My father went forward and assured me that they only wanted me to return home safely and that everything was okay. My mother's tear-filled nod suggested that they were the victims of a rebellious teenager. I realized that fighting would exacerbate the situation and could land Lily's family in trouble. So I grabbed my belongings and accompanied my parents to the car as Lily observed from her bedroom window. The journey home was entirely peaceful, safe for my mother, humming wedding songs under her breath as if nothing had happened. When we arrived into our driveway, I realized why she was so calm. Our entire backyard had been converted into a wedding site with white chairs lined up in neat rows facing an archway draped in fake flowers. Catering tables surrounded the side of the house while strings of lights formed a canopy over the dance floor. My mother guided me through the arrangement, describing where the photographer would stand and how the guests would enter via the side gate. She pointed out the specific chair decorations for family members and the location for the cake table, as if we were organizing a regular party rather than a forced wedding between teenagers. My father drew me into the kitchen while she continued to change floral arrangements, and his hands shook as he held my shoulders. He asked me to just go through with the ceremony to keep my mother stable, stating that she had been preparing constantly for 3 days without sleep, and that he was afraid of what she would do if we canceled. Now he gave me receipts for everything she'd already paid for, including the catering deposit and DJ, and told me we'd lose thousands of dollars if we pulled out. The next morning, Luke arrived with his parents and older brother who had driven down from law school. They all sat in our living room with my mother serving coffee and cookies as if this were a usual family gathering. Luke's brother pulled out legal documents and proposed a compromise in which we would hold a commitment ceremony that resembled a wedding but had no legal ramifications. He said that it would be similar to a promise ring ceremony, allowing my mother to have her celebration while keeping both of us from actually getting married. My mother's face went through 10 different looks before she agreed, but she asked, we not tell any of the guests it wasn't real. She had us all swear to act like it was a real wedding, so she wouldn't feel ashamed in front of her relatives and friends. Karen called that afternoon to tell me she'd filed for an emergency custody hearing, claiming I needed a guardian appointed by the court owing to my parents' mental health issues. The hearing was scheduled for Monday, the day following my mother's planned ceremony for Sunday. Karen claimed that if I could only make it through the weekend, the court would probably intervene and take me from the house. 2 days felt like the longest span in the world, but it was also the last hope I had. Friday night was the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant that my mother had entirely hired out. Extended relatives had driven in from 3 different states, and everyone sat around tables adorned with white roses and baby breath. My aunt, who had always been wary of my mother's conduct, rose up to make a toast, and I could feel my mother tense up immediately. Instead of wishing us well, my aunt informed all 40 guests that this was a bogus wedding between minors organized by a mentally ill mother who required psychiatric care. The room erupted into commotion, with half of the family shrieking at my aunt and the other half agreeing with her. My mother rose up and screamed that everyone was attempting to ruin her wonderful moment before grabbing a wine glass and throwing it at the wall. She kept throwing plates and glasses while sobbing, claiming that no one knew how much she loved me and wanted me to be happy. My father and 2 uncles had to physically restrain her and carry her outside to the car while she yelled threats at everyone who had betrayed her. Back at home, my father eventually broke down and acknowledged that he had been tolerating my mother's illness for years because he was afraid of her suicide attempts. He took out a notepad from his desk drawer and gave me pages of documentation on her manic episodes dating back to when I was 5 years old. Each entry detailed how her breakdowns were caused by routine milestones such as starting kindergarten, getting my first period, or turning 16. He'd been watching the pattern, but had never gotten her help since she threatened suicide every time he proposed therapy or medicine. The journal contained dates and descriptions of her threatening to drive off bridges or take drugs if he did not agree to anything she wanted. Later that night, Chloe entered my room brandishing scissors from the kitchen drawer. She sat on my bed and proposed that we cut all of my hair off to make me look too terrible for wedding photos so Mom would cancel. We both began laughing despite our tears, knowing that nothing would stop her at this point. She'd probably simply get me a wig and pretend everything was all right. Chloe grabbed my hand and stated she was worried about what would happen to her if I went, because Mom would need a new project to worry about. Early on Sunday morning, before anybody else was up, the pastor knocked on my bedroom door. He sat in my desk chair and informed me that he had spoken with Karen about the custody hearing and would testify about all he had witnessed. He also stated that if I gave him any signal during the ceremony, such as dropping my bouquet or stating the wrong name, he would object and interrupt the proceedings. He'd already planned a speech about how the marriage could not be blessed by God because it was coerced and included children. I awoke 2 hours later to find my mother sitting on my bed holding the laminated dating contract she had made me sign when I was 14. She had scissors in her hand and was cutting it into little bits that dropped like confetti on my comforter. She gave me a twisted smile and said she was wrong to restrict me with rules and contracts because this wedding shone she trusted me to make adult decisions now. The doorbell rang and my mother sprang up to answer it, while I sat there staring at the fragments of my old contract scattered about my bed. Lily entered my room with a bridesmaid dress in one hand and a backpack in the other, which she deposited behind my dresser with a look that told it all. My cousins, who were meant to be the other bridesmaids, stood in my doorway muttering about whether they should even be present for this bizarre wedding. Chloe had her phone out texting everyone about how to prevent this situation from occurring while pretending to take selfies in her outfit. My mother returned lugging a massive white bridal gown that resembled something out of a fairy tale and instructed me to begin preparing because guests would come in 2 hours. I stood up to remove the dress and noticed something wet on my stomach where my surgery scar was supposed to heal. When I lifted my shirt, blood was leaking through the bandage and the wound had split open about an inch due to stress. I showed my mother, hoping that would finally convince her to cancel everything, but she just grabbed some cosmetics and fashion tape from the bathroom. She put the tape over the bloodied bandage and applied concealer, assuring me that nothing could ruin this wonderful day. My phone flashed with a text from Luke informing me that his parents had phoned reporters and that press vans were already outside the venue, but my mother had no idea. Chloe had uploaded the entire tale on Reddit last night, and now legitimate news teams wanted to cover the forced teen wedding. The doorbell rang again and Dr. Patel walked in, still dressed in hospital scrubs and looking quite disturbed. She had heard from other doctors at the hospital about what was going on and came to check on me because I was only a week out from major surgery. She took one glance at the blood pouring through my clothing and brought me to the bathroom to assess the reopened wound. Her hands shook as she treated the wound, and she informed me that I was medically unsuited for any stress at this time. She threatened to call an ambulance if my parents forced me to go through with this event. My mother overheard her conversation and stormed into the bathroom yelling that everyone was attempting to ruin my happiness. She grabbed my arm and began leading me toward the backyard where they had set up all of the chairs and decorations. My father finally stepped in and grabbed my mother's shoulders, preventing her from pulling me outside. She began punching him and yelling that everyone was attempting to destroy our family while guests looked through the windows. Someone must have phoned 911 since 3 police cars arrived and officers ran into our property. Guests scattered in all directions as the cops separated my parents and attempted to figure out what was going on. The paramedics who arrived with them took one glance at my mother and began questioning her about her mental state. She begged me to assure them she was all right, but I stood there too tired to say anything else. They took her in an ambulance for a psychiatric examination while she wailed about wanting to give me everything she never had. I saw the bridal arch standing empty in our garden with flowers dying in the midday light. My mother couldn't distinguish the difference between her own youthful fantasies and what I truly want for my life. Later that evening, my aunt arrived and began sending visitors home while contacting vendors to cancel everything. She took out her phone and showed me movies she had been recording of my mother's conduct for months. She stated that my mother had episodes like this before I was born, and the family had been coping with her issues for years. Karen, a social worker, arrived with emergency custody documents, which designated my aunt as my temporary guardian. My hands shook as I signed the paperwork, and my surgery site throbbed with each movement. Luke grasped my other hand as I realized I couldn't legally live in my own home anymore. My father sat at the kitchen table, ultimately breaking down in tears about how he had remortgaged our property to pay for this wedding. He said my mother had been spending money they didn't have on insane ideas for years, and we were now absolutely broke. He admitted that he needed help as well because he had been encouraging her illness rather than providing her with proper care. The next 3 days were a haze of packing boxes and signing paperwork. While my Aunt Karen handled all of the legal paperwork with CPS, she drove me to my first therapy visit in the little downtown office building where the therapist hung images of mountains on every wall. I sat on her brown leather couch for the first 20 minutes, unable to form words because everything seemed too vast to express. The therapist simply handed me tissues and waited as I stared at my hands, trying to understand how love could develop into something so twisted. Chloe arrived at Karen's rental property that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a plush elephant from when she was 5. We moved the twin beds together in the guest room, and she crawled in next to me the first night, just like we used to do during thunderstorms. She informed me she had been seeing a counselor at school for 6 months because she sensed something was wrong with our family, but didn't know what to do. Days later, Luke picked me up for our first real date, where we didn't have to lie or sneak around. We went to a pizza establishment near his school and then watched an action movie. But halfway through, I realized we had no idea what to talk about unless a catastrophe occurred. We sat in his car later and decided to start anew and get to know each other like normal people. The custody hearing took place 2 weeks later in a massive courtroom that smelled like old carpet and coffee. Pastor Collins testified about my parents' troubling behavior at church and how they had separated our family from regular activities. Dr. Patel reviewed my medical records and highlighted how near I had been to death due to the ruptured appendix. Lily's mother recounted finding me crying at their house several times over my parents' rules. Everyone in the courtroom fell silent as they saw blood oozing through my bridal dress, which my mother had only concealed with cosmetics and tape. What was going on in her mind to make her believe that was okay? Karen presented all of the evidence, including covert recordings of our mother's meltdowns that Chloe had made on her phone. My mother sat at the opposite table, appearing smaller than I'd ever seen her in a gray clothing I didn't know. When it was her turn, she stood up and revealed that she had bipolar disorder and had stopped taking her medication 2 years before. She stated arranging my wedding seemed like the most love she'd ever showed me, even though she now realizes how wrong she was. The judge listened to everything and concluded that while mental illness may explain behavior, it does not excuse endangering children. He signed the paperwork designating Karen as our legal guardian right there in the courtroom. 2 weeks later, I returned to school, and everyone stared at me in the hallways as if I were a celebrity or a victim. Some kids wanted to take selfies with me after seeing the Reddit thread that went viral. Others murmured behind their hands or gave me pitying looks, making me want to hide in the restroom. I concentrated on catching up on all of the assignments I had missed, while my teachers repeatedly asked if I needed extensions or counseling. My AP classes were a catastrophe, and I had 3 weeks to improve my grades before the college application deadline. Karen brought me back to my old residence on a Saturday morning to grab my clothes and school supplies because we knew my parents would be at therapy appointments. The wedding arch was still in the garden, covered in dead flowers and bird droppings. Except for the 3 holes my mother had punched in the wall next to my bed, my room appeared to be unchanged. We packed everything into boxes, and I tried not to look at the family portraits that remained in the hallway. Lily picked me up the next day and declared that we were having a typical teenage girl day with no mention of parents' court or trauma. We had our nails done in bright pink and ate far too much ice cream at the mall food court. At the movie theater, we ran into some students who kept staring, but didn't say anything about the tale everyone had read online. For 3 hours, I remembered what it was like to be 17 and worry about simple things like whether my nail polish matched my dress. A month later, my father's therapist phoned Karen and asked if I might attend a family session with him. I sat in that beige office as my father grieved, saying he had failed me by prioritizing my mother's stability over my own. He stated that he was afraid of her getting worse if he challenged her, but it made him accountable for what transpired. I couldn't forgive him yet, but I told him I was glad he was finally accepting responsibility. That same week, the admissions office at Berkeley sent me an email requesting a statement on my familial circumstances. My hands shook as I read it, fearing they would reject me due to the disarray. Instead, they offered me a grant specifically for students surviving familial trauma and stated that they had support resources available if I needed them. Karen assisted me in writing a response that explained everything, and I cried with relief that my future wasn't utterly lost. About a month later, Luke's parents contacted Karen's house and asked if I may join them for dinner that weekend. I sat in their living room feeling strange about being there after what had happened with CPS. His mother brought out a large plate of handmade lasagna, and his father kept refilling my water glass every time I took a sip. They both immediately began talking about how sorry they were for phoning CPS without first consulting with me. His mother grabbed my hand and stated their house was always open if I needed a secure place to go. The following week, Chloe and I attended to a support group Karen had located for children whose parents had mental health issues. We sat in metal folding chairs in a church basement, listening to other teenagers discuss their mother's bipolar episodes and father's schizophrenia. One girl described her mother organizing her 16th birthday party 12 times, and it made me cry because it sounded exactly like Diane. Chloe sat there with her arms crossed till this boy mentioned being angry at his elder sister for not sheltering him from their father's mood swings. She finally looked at me and said she was upset because I didn't realize how bad our family was until it was too late. After the meeting, we sat in my car for 2 hours while she told me about all the time she had hidden in her closet while our parents argued. Days later, a hefty letter arrived at Karen's residence bearing the return address of my parents' lawyer. Inside was a 10-page letter from Diane written in her tiny handwriting that alternated between apologizing and explaining why she had done everything. She said that she and Mark were planned a butterfly-themed vow renewal ceremony next spring with genuine monarch butterflies to be released. That same afternoon, the lawyer called to inform me that my parents had filed for bankruptcy due to all of the wedding debt and Diane's credit card debts. He said my education fund was depleted, but Karen had already launched a GoFundMe campaign, which raised $12,000 in 3 days from individuals who had been following my story online. Complete strangers were sending $20 and $50 donations, along with remarks about how brave I was for revealing everything. Graduation day arrived faster than I had anticipated, and I was adjusting my cap in the bathroom mirror when Lily texted that my parents were in the theater. Security guards were already approaching them, but I walked over and informed them everything was fine since I realized I could manage being in the same room with them now. Diane cried throughout the ceremony as Mark held her hand and kept bringing her tissues from his jacket pocket. After they called my name and I walked across the stage, Diane rose up and clapped so loudly that everyone turned to look at her. When the ceremony was over, she proceeded toward me with Mark directly behind her, seeming apprehensive and protective at the same time. She looked different with shorter hair and matching clothes as opposed to the random colorful colors she typically wore. She handed me a card with a $500 check inside and claimed she was feeling better after taking her new prescription correctly. I accepted the card and nodded, but I made no promises to contact or visit because I wasn't ready yet. The next day, Pastor called Karen's residence and asked if he could do a special blessing ceremony for my future, as the wedding blessing had never occurred. We met at the church on a Tuesday evening with Karen, Chloe, Lily, and even Luke's entire family in the front pews. He spoke of travels, healing, and new beginnings while sprinkling holy water on my head, and it seemed like my genuine wedding. Luke and I sat in his car later discussing what would happen when I departed for Berkeley in 2 months. We both knew that the pain of everything had brought us together, but we wanted to figure out if there was anything genuine beneath it all. We decided to attempt long distance without making any huge vows about forever, since we'd had enough of being compelled to commit. I had to testify in the state capitol regarding adolescent marriage laws and parental consent requirements a week before leaving for college. I sat at this big table, a microphone in front of me, telling a room full of politicians about the wedding dress, the location, and the surgery. 3 different representatives stated that they would introduce measures requiring therapy before parents could consent to their minor children's marriage. Moving day eventually arrived, and Karen put my belongings into her SUV as Chloe moaned about having to drive 4 hours to Berkeley and back. We drove by my former house, which had a for sale sign in the front yard with a sold sticker on it. Diane was standing in the living room window watching the street and our gazes connected for a split second before Karen turned the corner. The rest of the drive was silent with the exception of Chloe playing phone games and Karen checking on me through the mirror every few minutes. When we arrived at my dorm, Berkeley's campus appeared vast, and I watched other families unload cars full of matching bedding sets and brand new mini fridges. My belongings fit in 3 cartons and 1 suitcase, but Karen helped me bring everything up to the 3rd story, where my roommate was already unpacking. She looked up from arranging photos on her desk, and her eyes widened. "Wait, are you the girl from that Reddit post about the forced wedding?" I agreed and braced myself for criticism, but she sat on her bed and told me about her own mother who had tried to force her to marry her cousin back in Pakistan. We sat up until 300 a.m., swapping stories about strange families. And I discovered I wasn't the only one with insane parents. Weeks later, I attended my first genuine college party where no one knew anything about my past other than what I chose to tell them. When a guy asked about my family while we were playing beer pong, I just shrugged and stated it was complicated without having to describe the entire situation. The independence of not owing anyone my trauma felt better than I could have imagined. I plunged myself into classes and gained friends who recognized me as Emma, not the girl whose parents sought to compel her to marry. Chloe contacted me months into freshman year, crying so hard that I couldn't understand what she was saying. Mom got pregnant again at 43, having gone off her pills during another manic episode in which she believed medication was harming her body. I felt the usual need to drop everything and go home to help, but I stayed in my dorm room and talked Chloe through it on the phone instead. She was primarily doing it on her own as Dad had moved into an apartment after confessing he couldn't handle it anymore. Chloe's decision to save all of those recordings on her phone demonstrates thoughtful forethought. I wonder how long she had been documenting their mother's conduct before anybody else noticed. The manner she prepared evidence leads me to believe she comprehended the problem long before Emma. When autumn break arrived, Luke drove up from Los Angeles where he was having a gap year working at his uncle's auto shop. We walked across campus holding hands like normal college students, and he handed me his acceptance letter to Cal Poly for the spring semester. He kissed me farewell at the airport, and we both realized we were not the same kids who had crept about Riverside. We didn't talk about the almost wedding or make any commitments for the future since we were finally allowed to be 19 and unsure. The divorce papers arrived by certified mail just before Thanksgiving, along with a message from my father's lawyer explaining that Mark had been in therapy for 6 months. It turns out he never wanted the wedding either, but he couldn't stand up to Diane when she was having one of her episodes. The marriage that was supposed to be mine was ending for them instead, and I giggled alone in my dorm room at how twisted everything had become. Winter break arrived, and Karen took me up to stay at her house rather than return to Riverside. We baked sugar cookies and watched Christmas movies, and Julia eventually admitted to me that she had sensed something was wrong for many years, but Diane was continuously threatening to harm herself if anyone interfered. "I should have called CPS anyway," she remarked, as we decorated a gingerbread home. I assured her that we all did our best with what we knew. After New Year's, I began writing about all that had happened on a blog that I estimated just 10 people would read. The first piece about spotting familial dysfunction received 50,000 shares in 2 days, and my inbox was full of letters from youngsters in similar situations. I unintentionally became someone who assisted other youngsters in escaping their own familial crisis. In February, Chloe informed me that she had submitted her Berkeley early admission application, which included an essay about perseverance and survival. She wanted the same fresh start as I had, and she assured she was already saving money from her target job for the relocation. I assisted her with scholarship applications and SAT preparation via video conferences. Being the protective big sister I couldn't be when we were both drowning. The spring semester rushed quickly with finals and plans for sophomore year when I would finally declare my psychology major. 1 year after the wedding that never happened, a Facebook message appeared from an account I didn't recognize. Diane, posting from a new profile, said she was fine taking her medicine and working part-time at a craft store. She did not request to see me or beg for forgiveness. She just wanted me to know she was striving to get better. I stared at the message for an hour before shutting it and not responding. But I didn't block her either, since maybe one day I'll be ready to hear more. Now I'm here in my dorm room doing my final thesis on family systems and mental health while running my finger over the thin scar on my tummy that started it all. My phone is constantly buzzing with typical 19-year-old activity such as Luke sending idiotic memes from his dorm, Chloe inquiring about twin XL linens for next year, and Lily sharing party pics from USC. This is the life my parents sought to shield me from, believing they were shielding me from wrong decisions and tragedy. Instead, they nearly killed me with their protection, and I had to save myself from their rescue. I closed my laptop and grabbed my backpack for study group, going across campus in the California sunshine toward a future I'm finally selecting for myself, one typical adolescent step at a time. I really appreciated discussing all of these issues with you today. I love just pondering about everything.